Right, everyone, we have got a treat for you because we have got medieval historian Marc Morris with us. You'll need to click on the bottom right to turn your sound off on those laptops, on the little speaker symbol on the bottom right. So what we'll do first, Mark, is if you could just introduce yourself to all the students in terms of who you are and what you do.
Okay, well, that's easily done. My name's Mark. I am a medieval historian. I don't work at a university or a college. I'm sort of self-employed, and most of the time I spend in this tiny room writing books about the Middle Ages. So if you give me 10 seconds or
Yeah.
less, so things like, for example, that was my most recent one. It's a big chunky one called The Anglo-Saxons. That's most. I do other things as well, but yeah, that's me. A long time ago, sort of a Ghost of Christmas Past version of me did some TV for Channel 4, which some people remember. But yeah, I study mostly Britain and Ireland, and mostly, I would say, mostly sort of post Norman Conquest. But the Anglo-Saxon book I just showed you gives the lie to that. So I sort of do everything medieval up to about 1300.
And just to capture it for the students here, Mark's job is historian. So he works mainly in that room, writing books about the things we've been studying. Now, just to give you a little picture here, Mark, the students have been doing power and control in the medieval period. That's what they've been most recently been doing. So they've been looking at Thomas Becket. They've been looking at the Peasants' Revolt. They've been looking at the Magna Carta. They've been looking at the creation of Parliament. So I've got a little question for you to start with, just to get things going, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to ask, who do you think the king in the medieval period had more power than the church? Do you think the church was more powerful? Do you think it was equally, or where was the balance of power?
It's a challenging question. I'd probably go with the king. I think the king, if push came to shove, kings generally came out on top because they have sort of a monopoly of real world power, kind of physical violence. The problem with that, of course, in the case of Henry II and Becket, is Henry shoves too hard and Becket ends up dead, which is really, really damaging for Henry II. It nearly costs him his throne and all his widespread possessions because it's so beyond the pale. The murder of an archbishop in his own cathedral, it scandalizes all of Europe and mobilizes or enables other secular rulers to try and take Henry down. But generally speaking, if you look at really unpopular monarchs like King John, who falls out with the church, he ends up getting his own way. Edward I as well, a more successful but nevertheless very menacing monarch, ends up kind of getting the church to toe the line just by sort of, flexing his muscles. So it's not to say the church isn't important, and the church can be very, very influential in dealing with with kings. But I would say I would probably, if I had to make a bet, I would probably bet on the king in any fight. But it's kind of like they are such different spheres of power. It's not like saying, who would you choose in a fight between these two kings? You could just tot up and say, this guy has the most money, this guy has the most military resources, this guy is more favored by landscape or geography or whatever, and you're comparing apples with apples. With the church and the crown, you're comparing apples and oranges. It's like, these aren't the same thing. It's a very different way of wielding power and influence.
Spot on. Listen, we've had our first question, which is actually a really good one. So
Okay.
Javier, which you can see on screen, Javier says, Mark, who was the most powerful king in the period that we've studied? Now, bear in mind, they have basically studied not the whole period, but they've gone 1066 all the way through to, I guess, the start of the 1400s. So we're probably going like 1066 through to say 1400. And obviously we're talking specifically about England.
That's a very easy one then. So we're talking about Edward I, about whom I've also written a book. And Edward I is not particularly well-known king. I don't know if he ever intrudes onto the curriculum, but Edward I suffers, I think, in the fact that he hasn't got a Shakespeare play written about him. So if you mention other later, less powerful medieval kings like Henry V or Henry VI or anybody, King John even, they are well known because they have Shakespeare plays. Edward I doesn't. But in terms of power within the British Isles, say, he's the king who conquers Wales. So he adds all of Wales to his empire, if you like. He conquers Scotland. Scotland is kind of still under English occupation at the time of his death, although doesn't ultimately hold. And he's also lord of large parts of Ireland. So just within Britain and Ireland, this is Edward I's reign is the sort of the high watermark of English power within that archipelago. So I'm trying to think of anything else about Edward I. In terms of his sort of personal presence, he's incredibly tall. He's 6'2", when the average medieval man is 5'8". And he goes on crusade. He visits every part of Britain, as far north as kind of Aberdeenshire, and as far west as the furthest islands off the Welsh coast. He lives by medieval standards, or by medieval monarch standards, he lives a very long time. He's 68 when he dies, which sounds like he's been shortchanged.
That's what I was going to, Mark, I was going to ask you actually, because this is interesting for the students. What was the life expectancy of, I mean, you might not know this, but what was the life expectancy of sort of average overall life expectancy during the medieval period, say in the year 1300, that sort of time period? I mean, how long are people being expected to live for?
Well, the only answer I think the best answer I can give you is the answer that they would have been given from their Bibles at the time, would be given by your, Bibles today. The life of man is 70 years and 10, i.e. 70. That was considered to be your allotted time span. But of course, there are lots of things that could sort of shortchange you in that regard. You could be carried away by plague, or any kind of disease. You're particularly prone in this period to dying as children. Infant mortality is very high. If you made it through childhood, your chances of surviving were probably pretty good. But it depended on random acts of violence. And if you are part of the warrior elite, so that's anybody from the king down, the king, the earls, the barons, the knights, etc., and you're called upon to throw yourself into violent situations from time to time, then there is a risk that you will end up dead. And I think in the case of kings, so to interrupt myself for a second, so if, for example, I would hope to sort of, if I'd lived in this period, to do the kind of job I'm doing now and be a medieval chronicler or something, because you're living in a community that gives you lots of support. If you're living in a monastery, you've got kind of people to look after you if you get sick, for example. You've got a hospital wing, etc., and you're generally sort of well looked after by that community, so it's collegiate. So you do find medieval monks or priests or clerics of any kind who live a long time. They live into their 70s or even their 80s or 90s. In the case of kings, you have all the wealth and the luxury, but you also have the job of effectively being prime minister your whole life. So if you're king from the age of 18 or something, then you are going to have people from the moment you wake up in the morning to the moment you close your eyes at night pestering you, saying, I just want a verdict on this, or can you help me out with this court case, or the King of France has invaded, what are we going to do? And they are forever responding to one sort of rolling crisis. Even when it's quiet, it's never quiet to be the king. That's why they like going hunting, so they can get away from politics. So kings seldom live, beyond their 50s. If you think of the medieval kings you mentioned, William the Conqueror dies 59. Henry II is in his 50s. Some of them die younger. Richard, William Rufus and Richard are both killed by arrows. Edward I, therefore, making it to 68 and dying effectively of an illness at old age is exceptional in that regard.
Right, we're going to go through quick fire now. We've got quite a few student questions, so try and answer these as succinctly as you can, but obviously some of them may be more challenging. This one is from Claudia, who says, what do you think was the main characteristic of a king that made people like him?
Oh, to be liked.
In the medieval period.
Probably, it depends on who you mean doing the liking. If it's his courtiers, if it's the people close to him, then it's generosity. So people who are dependent on handouts, the rich, I don't mean the poor. I mean, people who want more land, more gold, they always say, oh, he was incredibly generous. What a generous king, what a benevolent king, because he gave us what we wanted. In terms of the bulk of the population, the thing they tend to look for the most is justice. So they say he was a good king. He did justice. His sheriffs were very just. He was always he was really interested in kind of making people's lives better. And he took that element of the role very seriously. So that's probably the best answers I can give. That, good kings are just in the eyes of most of their subjects.
Yeah. Next one. Who do you think was the worst king of the period in general?
King John. About whom I've written a book. King John, absolute rotter. I mean, some people in the 20th century tried to rehabilitate King John to make people think better of him, because they said, oh, he was very industrious and he was very energetic, and and he was, and it's like, kind of, so what? If you look at what people said about him at the time, even people who were quite close to him and sort of like on his side, they described him as a villain. Because even by medieval standards, he was exceptionally cruel. He not routinely, but periodically, occasionally, he would starve people to death if they'd opposed him, which is about as cruel a death as you can inflict on anybody. And, so it's not just that, John, people tend to sometimes sort of say to me, oh, well, all medieval kings were cruel, all medieval kings were bad. No, they weren't, because some of them were successful, and some of them were successful and had reputations for being just and, honest or valiant, And John has none of those redeeming qualities, which is why he sort of died a failure, having lost his crown in the wash. So, King John, without a shadow of doubt, easily the worst.
Here's a good question from Dario. What would have happened if the peasants had attacked and killed the king?
You're going outside my specialism now, because I stop in 1300. I mean, it's an interesting what if. I'm trying to think of examples where kings have been killed, but they're very seldom killed by peasants. They're occasionally killed in battle. Richard I, let's go with Richard I, because Richard I was killed by a crossbowman. And I'm not familiar in detail with the sources, but I think in some sources he's forgiven. In other sources, he's kind of taken out and sort of flayed alive. So I think probably it's kind of like, it's one thing to kill the king, but you're not going to overturn a kind of hierarchical monarchical system. So the system is going to get you sooner or later. You might kill the king and enjoy that for 5 minutes, but other would-be kings and other powerful landowners are going to come and make your life a misery. So
perfect. This is a good question on people, so it's more on the social side. From Mia, what was the usual age to marry in medieval times?
Oh, that's a good question to which I don't know the answer. I think it's probably older than you might expect. And it depends on your social class. So if you, for example, are a woman, or a man for that matter, but let's go with a woman. So let's say you're a woman and you are the heir to, say, huge estates in Essex. And you're 12 years old, and everybody sees you as if you were to marry my son, then our family would get all those huge lands in Essex. Once you're 12 years old, that is the minimum age for marriage according to the medieval church. So at that point, you are likely to be married because you are worth so much money. So I think it's different for the high aristocracy or even just the landed elite. But if it was kind of like more, as you would expect the majority of people today, it's like, well, we're not going to prosper unless we have, managed to accrue more wealth ourselves. then you might want to wait until later in life. So I think, speaking out of school here, but I would imagine for the sort of the majority of people, they could be marrying, into their late teens or early 20s. But you, as I say, if you represent not just kind of like, oh, this would be a good hardworking man for me to marry, and he's got his own cows and he's 32. If you represent, you're just your huge tracts of land is what you represent, then you're going to be sort of snapped up as soon as you are 12.
Yeah, as soon as you're 12, young age to marry. Carla and Danny have got this one. In medieval times, were peasants expected to obey the king? Did the king care about the peasants and their problems?
Well, I mean, they weren't expected to obey the king directly. What you were expected to do was to obey your lord. So you have this hierarchical system where the king is at the top, and then everyone's ultimately answerable to the king. But if you were a peasant and you were tied to the land, then someone was your lord, someone local. There were various degrees of liberty that you could have. So at the bottom end of the scale, you could be a serf and required to work. I mean, in the period we're dealing with, up to 1300, serfdom still exists. So you could be required to work 3 or 4 days a week on your lord's land, and you'd only have the remaining 2 or 3 days a week to work your own land. And there were all sorts of restrictions on your liberty. So you couldn't, marry your daughter without permission from the lord. You couldn't leave the estate without permission from your lord. So it's a kind of soft form of slavery. It's not like old school chattel slavery where you can be mutilated or killed or branded, but it's nevertheless severely limiting. Or you could be a prosperous free person as a peasant and sort of, only have light responsibilities to your lord. Payment of a rent might be quite small, and basically allowed to farm your own land undisturbed. And what was the remaining part of the question? Was did the king care about peasants? Well, up to a point in that, I mean, yes, some kings are very conscientious, and they take the lessons that are handed down to them via their teachers very seriously, and they're told that this is a huge responsibility. It's conferred on you by God, and your responsibility is to protect your people. But it's where sort of that sort of noble sense of I am appointed by God to rule these people is also sort of mixes with self-interest, because if you do not govern properly, then that's basically if your people are, say, attacked by other rulers, then you are going to lose out. You're not going to be able to sort of get enough revenue in the form of taxes. So it's in your self-interest as a ruler to make sure that you govern properly. So yes, they cared about them to varying degrees. You had to care somewhat. Some of them cared a great deal.
Perfect. Okay, this is Inez and Paloma. If the Magna Carta did not exist, now they've said, would England be different? Girls, do you mean different then, or do you mean different today, or both? Yeah, they said both.
Both. Okay. If it didn't, I mean, I think the thing is, what makes Magna Carta special is this is going to sound really obvious. It's really big. Okay, Magna Carta, as you know, literally means the big card or the big charter, and it's a very comprehensive statement of liberties, things that the king is expected to grant or is expected to uphold. So, I think probably a lot of those things, if Magna Carta hadn't been granted at the end of King John's reign, then a lot of those things might have been granted piecemeal, in little bits and pieces over the coming decades. So I think, a lot of Magna Carta was kind of codifying, that's to say, expressing in one document things that people have been asking for previous decades or even centuries. So I don't think I'm not one of those people who thinks Magna Carta was kind of like, some kind of beacon of liberty across the centuries. It has that sort of appeal, but I think it was really important in the 13th century and going on to the 14th century. It becomes less important as the centuries wear on.
Perfect.
It's certainly no good today to sort of turn to Magna Carta and say, I'm allowed to get my hair cut during lockdown because of Magna Carta.
This one is, again, sort of linked, same question, so it's sort of linked. What did the peasants think about Magna Carta, as this document didn't include them?
Well, it did. You see, this is one of the great myths about Magna Carta. Is people say, "Oh, it was." You get this on Twitter all the time. "Oh, Magna Carta was only for barons." No, it wasn't. Magna Carta, if you look at its opening clause, is King John grants Magna Carta to quote all free people, liberi homines, which sometimes translated free men, but more properly free people. Now, as I said, there's various degrees of being a peasant. If you were a serf, Magna Carta not much good to you. There's one clause about sort of peasants being shan't be taxed beyond their livelihood, but otherwise it's all the clauses in Magna Carta are granted to free people. Now, free people in 1215 is about 30% of the population, so it's emphatically not just the aristocracy or the barons, but about 1,000,000 people. And when Magna Carta is reissued in the 14th century, that bit about free people is dropped and it's granted to all people by Edward III. So it is ultimately granted to everybody. Having said all of that, quite a lot of the clauses would only affect you if you were relatively wealthy landowners. So when it's talking about paying scutage to the king, but there's a lot of the not a lot, but the kind of the main clauses in it, like you won't be justice won't be sold, denied, or delayed, and that the king won't go against people and destroy them with his, except by the judgment of their peers or the law of the land. That's all quite important stuff, So it's I think one of the things that Magna Carta springs from is barons saying, we've had enough of King John's oppression, because he really did pick on his barons because they were wealthy. And a lot of it is to try and stop the king's money-getting ability. But there's also an awful lot of stuff in Magna Carta which does apply in the first instance to free people and ultimately to everybody.
This is a good little question. And it's one that certain students have asked me about actually in this class and other classes. I'll link this into a wider question, but they've said, if you were a baron, could you become a peasant? But one of the questions that they'd often ask me is, if you were a peasant, could you become a baron? Or could you move between bits in the feudal system? Could you become go from baron to bishop, or peasant to baron, or be relegated from baron to peasant?
I love the idea of relegation. I can't think of anybody who's kind of ends up relegated. I'll try in the course of the answer, but certainly you could go up the chain. That was very possible. And the best way to do that was violence. So if you were really fit and strong, and the king said, or the king, you would just look, if you could say somehow join the household of your local lord, an aristocrat. This is just an analogy that occurs to me now, but let's say it's like, suppose you were to join your local under 12s football team, and you were really good at it. And then you might kind of get sort of a local league team, and then you might ultimately say, he's really good, you should have him. The same would go with violence. So if you were handy with a sword and 6 foot tall and really beefy, and you were able to join someone's military household and you were really good at it, then you could go up through the ranks, and you might ultimately join the royal household, and then the king might sort of say, have this castle or this lordship. Good example, he doesn't start off as a peasant, but he starts off as a fairly low aristocracy, is William Marshall. If you look at William Marshall, Google him, he starts off as the sort of the son of a not particularly powerful royal retainer, and he ends up as regent of England after King John's reign. So he goes from sort of almost zero to a hero. The other way, I still can't think of any examples in terms of becoming a priest. That's often or a monk. That's often inflicted on laymen as an alternative, as a way of getting rid of them. So you might be presented, especially in the early Middle Ages, with a kind of now you're a real problem, aren't you? Gerald. So we'll give you 2 choices. 1, we can chop your head off, or 2, you can find God and have a new vocation as a monk in Glastonbury. And they say, oh, I'll go with the monk option B, please. So you sometimes find lay people are sort of forcibly tonsured, if you like, given a monastic crop like mine, and then put away in a monastery to keep them out of the way. So some people end up in the church against their will. I'm trying to think of an example. Barons often do fall from grace, but I think this is going to sound really kind of cynical and Trotskyist. But I think basically the rich look after their own. So even if they fall from grace, they tend to find somewhere else to kind of go, and someone gives them a bit of land, and so they might lose, say, the title of, say, Earl of Shrewsbury, but they'll end up in Normandy with some estates and a little castle to manage and other people to bully. They seldom end up in the street begging for change.
These two are sort of similar questions. So this one, did a baron have the power to kill a peasant or a knight, from Claudia? And the other one, which I can't actually see weirdly because it's got buried. From Javier, did the barons or the richer people have the right to abuse the peasants and cause them physical pain?
Short answer to both things is no. I mean, people are. This is sometimes people imagine the medieval period is completely lawless. It's not. England is thickly planted with laws. Same goes for Wales. Same goes for Scotland. So there are all kinds of legal protections and things you can't do. That's not to say people didn't break the law and abuse the law. And a lot of the things that you find written in chronicles are complaints about people overstepping the line and saying, well, the Earl came along and turfed us out of our houses and, burnt our houses down. But the reason you tend to hear about those things is because they are when people are breaking the law. And generally people are respectful of the law and the law is enforced. You certainly couldn't physically punish people. That would have been the case before the Norman Conquest, when there was chattel slavery. So if people were your slaves and they kicked off in some way, you could say, well, I'm going to sort of, chop your hand off or something, or in the worst case, kind of stone you to death. You can't do that after the Norman Conquest. But I think the one exception is people you call red-handed thieves. So if you actually catch people, if the community catches people and say, we caught him stealing sheep, theft is treated really seriously, because of course it's really hard to enforce. There's no police force. So it's like, it's a crime against the community. And then when they catch you sort of doing it, they will just sort of put a rope around a tree and string you up. So red-handed thieves is one exception, but you can't just generally say, I'm a baron and I don't like you and I'm going to run you through. That's a kind of a Hollywood myth.
This is a good one from Amina, who I think zooming in from a different school.
Okay.
She has said, well, it's a very general question. What was their diet? Well, I don't know whether you might know, starting off with the peasants, Mark, in terms of the average peasant waking up on a Monday morning, what would they actually be eating and drinking?
I honestly couldn't tell you, because I mean it's not only my forte. I honestly don't care. It seems to me kind of like, that's very valuable if you want to study that, but it doesn't kind of affect the bigger outcomes, like, why was Wales like this? So I imagine it's cereal. They had beer. It's largely cereal because it's agricultural in England. In the upland parts of Britain, so Wales and Scotland, there is more meat consumed and more milk, because they are more pastoral societies. In other words, they are rearing sheep and cattle. But in England, the majority of their diet is going to be cereal. So yes, you can brew beer from it, you can make bread from it. There'll also be meat is expensive, so you're going to have a diet of vegetables, so peas and things, peas pottage, maybe the occasional chicken. Pigs are very popular, I gather, because pigs eat anything. Pigs are kind of like God's waste disposal units. So you can sort of, anything you leave in your garden, the pigs will eat. Other four-legged, other quadrupeds are more picky, apparently. But you see, I really don't know what I'm talking about. Well, you go further up the social scale. Of course, meat is highly prized, and there are certain meats that only the king can, or the aristocracy can, dine on. So venison, which you need to sort of hunt in your own parks. Dolphins, they're reserved to the king for some reason. Not that they got to eat them very often. The aristocracy are eating more meat. It doesn't necessarily do them any good. It gives them lots of protein, but it also means that they're very high in cholesterol. And without taking statins, which they didn't have, that's probably another reason they sort of keeled over off their horses in their 40s or 50s, because they're eating so much fatty meat.
School in Valencia, Cambridge House, how long did it take for them to build settlements?
I just going to say, after this, I've got to go. I've got to be at my son's school at 3, so I'll have to make the next one the last one. How long? Well, it sort of defines settlements. Some settlements grow up organically and they take decades or centuries. Others can be created in the space of a single summer. I mean, one of the things I'm studying in my new book is the way England expands, or the English people expand into Wales, Scotland, and Ireland across the High Middle Ages. And you do find kings and lords saying, right, I'm going to lay out a new town here. New places that are called Newtown or Newborough are often laid out at the king's command. And if you find things that look sort of like they have been, planned on a piece of parchment, and all the streets are very regular. So, for example, if you look at somewhere like a good place to Google off the top of my head would be Conwy or Conway in North Wales. There's a castle built by Edward I, but also a town laid out at the same time, which looks very, very regular. That was established in the space of a single summer, and the walls were put up in the space of about 3 years. So it's really, really quick. Town foundation can be.
Last question, Mark, before you go. How important was the relationship between England and Spain during medieval times?
Was there a relationship? I mean, it's not. Let me put it this way. I've been doing this for sort of 25, 30 years, and Spain very rarely crosses my radar. In the case of Edward I, about whom I wrote a book, he's married to a Spanish princess. So he's married to Eleanor of Castile. And that came about because on the principle of my enemy's enemy is my friend. For a lot of the time after 1066, the kings of England are at loggerheads, if not at war, with their rivals, the King of France. And as France kind of starts to nibble away at the English possessions in Western France, and they're sort of getting down towards Spain, then the kings of England are looking to both Spain and Portugal to act as allies against the King of France. But that is only really starting to happen at the end of my period of knowledge. It goes on more, I think, in the late Middle Ages when you get what's his name? I can't remember. One of them is called someone of Navarre. Someone is married, Philippa of Hainaut, and that sort of thing. Later Plantagenet kings are married to Spanish and Portuguese princesses, but I'm afraid they fall outside my remit.
Brilliant. Mark, I know you got to go, so thanks ever so much for taking the time. Thanks as well to Cambridge House in Valencia for joining us, and a few other schools around the world too. And thanks to my Year 7s for being so fantastic. Right. Amazing questions, weren't they?
They were fantastic. Very good. Very challenging. So thank you for that. Right.
Thank you, Mark.
It's been a pleasure.
Bye-bye.